Today is May 29th, 2026, and today is National Paperclip Day, which feels like one of those objects nobody thinks about until they suddenly need one immediately. And honestly, paperclips are kind of remarkable. Tiny bent pieces of metal quietly holding entire systems together, which ended up fitting today's episode more than I expected. Because May 29th kept circling back to moments where people suddenly realized the world itself was shifting underneath them. Empires collapsing, scientific rules changing, and entire populations convincing themselves giant venomous insects might be invading North America. Welcome to Wait, That's Random, This Day in History. I'm C.L. Burns, voice actor, audiobook narrator, and someone who apparently spends an unhealthy amount of time wandering through historical rabbit holes so you don't have to. On May 29, 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Empire. And for people living at the time, it genuinely felt like the end of a world, because in many ways it was. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople had stood as one of the greatest cities on earth. It was wealthy, strategically powerful, massively fortified. Its walls were considered nearly impossible to breach, and perhaps most importantly, it represented continuity. The Byzantine Empire saw itself as the continuation of the Roman Empire itself. So when Constantinople fell, people weren't just watching a city change hands. They were watching the final collapse of something connected to ancient Rome. And the siege itself was enormous. Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II assembled massive forces around the city, including giant cannons capable of battering walls that had survived centuries of invasions. One cannon reportedly required dozens of oxen just to move it. The city's defenders were heavily outnumbered, but they still fought fiercely. Chains were stretched across waterways to block ships. Church bells rang constantly. Citizens reportedly gathered in prayer as explosions shook the walls. And one detail I kept thinking about while reading through this story is how strange the final hours must have felt emotionally, because many people inside Constantinople likely understood they were witnessing history ending in real time. That's an incredibly rare human experience. Usually historical eras only become obvious in hindsight. But this one, people could feel it happening. Eventually, Ottoman forces breached the walls. The final Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, reportedly removed imperial symbols from his uniform and entered the fighting directly rather than flee. And afterward, the city transformed. Constantinople became Istanbul. Trade routes shifted. Political power shifted. Religious tensions shifted. Even exploration history changed indirectly. Because disruptions to Eastern trade routes helped encourage European powers to search for new routes elsewhere, which eventually contributed to the age of exploration itself. That's one of the strangest things about history. Sometimes the collapse of one city quietly reshapes the entire planet afterward. But centuries later, people would experience another moment where reality itself seemed to shift. Not politically this time, but scientifically. On May 29, 1919, a solar eclipse helped change humanity's understanding of the universe. And honestly, one thing I love about this story is how cinematic it feels. Because the experiment itself depended entirely on darkness appearing at exactly the right moment. Albert Einstein had proposed the theory of general relativity several years earlier. And one of its strangest predictions was this: gravity could bend light. Not metaphorically, literally. According to Einstein, massive objects like the sun warped space itself, which meant starlight passing near the sun should appear slightly displaced. The problem was, normally the sun's brightness makes nearby stars impossible to observe, except during a total solar eclipse. So in 1919, expeditions traveled to observe the eclipse carefully and test Einstein's prediction. And when the measurements were analyzed, they matched. Light appeared bent exactly as Einstein predicted. Newspapers exploded with headlines: "Revolution in Science. Newtonian ideas overthrown." And almost overnight, Einstein transformed from respected physicist into global celebrity. which is still kind of a strange thing to think about, because theoretical physicists rarely become internationally famous household names. But Einstein represented something bigger. The feeling that reality itself had become stranger than people assumed. And honestly, relativity was difficult for many people to understand. It still is. But that almost added to the fascination. The universe suddenly felt less fixed, less certain, less mechanical. And I think people sensed that emotionally even if they didn't understand the equations. One scientific observation during a darkened sky suddenly helped humanity realize the universe was far more flexible and mysterious than it once appeared. And speaking of people reacting emotionally to things they barely understood, May 29th also sits right in the middle of one of the strangest internet panics in recent memory. In May of 2020, the phrase murder hornets suddenly entered public conversation, which, to be fair, already sounds like something invented by a horror movie marketing team. The insects themselves were Asian giant hornets, large, aggressive when threatened, capable of devastating bee populations. And while they were real, the internet rapidly transformed them into something almost mythological, partly because of timing, because this was 2020. People were already stressed, already isolated, already doom-scrolling constantly, and the headlines started appearing about giant hornets with painful stings arriving in North America, which felt emotionally perfect for that particular year. At one point, it almost seemed like every week introduced a new sentence nobody expected to hear. And what fascinates me the most about the murder hornet panic is how modern fear spreads now. Historically, rumors traveled slowly. Now, fear moves globally in minutes. Photos spread instantly. Memes appear instantly. Jokes blend together with genuine concern. And before long, millions of people who had never seen one became emotionally convinced they were under threat from giant hornets, which honestly says as much about internet psychology as etymology. Scientists tried repeatedly to calm public fears. Actual sightings remained limited. The threat to most ordinary people was relatively low. But by then, the phrase itself had already escaped containment. Murder hornets. That's branding powerful enough to bypass rational thought immediately. And in a strange way, this story fits surprisingly well beside the earlier ones today. Because each story involves a moment where people suddenly realized the world might operate differently than they assumed. An empire can disappear. Physics can change. And modern panic can spread faster than the thing people are supposedly afraid of. And after spending so much time in today's stories thinking about uncertainty, fear, and massive world-changing moments, it actually felt refreshing to land on someone whose entire career revolved around helping people laugh through difficult periods. Born on May 29, 1903 in London, England, Bob Hope became one of the most recognizable entertainers of the 20th century. And for decades, he seemed almost permanently connected to American culture itself. Comedy, radio, television, movies, award shows, USO tours. Bob Hope somehow appeared everywhere. But one thing I didn't fully realize until reading more about him was how much of his reputation came from consistency, especially during wartime. For decades, Hope traveled to perform for U.S. troops stationed around the world, not once or twice, repeatedly. World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and regardless of political complexity surrounding those wars, many soldiers later described those performances as emotionally important because they temporarily made distant places feel normal again. Hope's comedy style also moved incredibly fast. Rapid-fire jokes, constant one-liners, a kind of relaxed confidence that made him feel conversational instead of theatrical. And maybe that's part of why audiences trusted him for so long. He didn't feel polished in a distant way. He felt familiar, like someone who had wandered into the room already halfway through a joke. Something I kept noticing while working through May 29th was how human beings react when certainty suddenly disappears. A city falls. Scientific rules change. The internet collectively panics about hornets. And in every case, people start searching for explanations almost immediately, because humans are remarkably good at adapting. But we are much less comfortable with uncertainty itself. We want systems to stay stable. We want the world to make sense. We want reality to behave predictably. And history keeps gently reminding us that none of those things are guaranteed forever. Anyway, that's what ended up sitting in my brain after working through May 29th. And before I leave you alone with your thoughts, here's today's quote. "The universe is under no obligation to make sense to you." Neil deGrasse Tyson. If you'd like to hear more of my work, audiobooks, or other projects I've somehow gotten myself involved in, you can find everything over at waitthat'srandom.com. I'm C.L. Burns, and honestly, thank you for spending a little time being curious with me. I'll see you tomorrow.